McKanan is the Emerson Senior Lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, where he's taught since 2008. His teaching and research focuses more broadly on religious movements of social transformation in the United States, with special emphasis on, among other things, environmentalism and intentional communities. He is really trying to bridge, and we hope you all help us do that, bridge our history to what we're doing now. For instance, he is the director at Harvard Divinity School of the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality, which is working with people all over the world on how religion is transforming how we think about the world. This talk will highlight the importance of citizen engagement for the preservation of the wild and recreational spaces in Cape Ann. Citizen care for particular places is a crucial tool for managing extreme weather events, as engaged citizens are likely to be the first to notice vulnerabilities and the most motivated to take action. That's why NOAA gives us money, because of that. To further that goal, we will invite audience members to share their own stories of caring for the wild or recreational areas, or just our day-to-day areas that we live in close to home. So, Dan, the pulpit is yours.
For the past few years, I have been exploring New England's unique contribution to the story of wild space conservation. When most Americans think about conservation, our attention focuses on wild lands west of the Mississippi, on federal policy, and on national parks. We might agree with filmmaker Ken Burns, who called the national parks America's best idea. But as I've explored the places close to Boston where I enjoy hiking, I've become convinced that state parks, and places like them, are in fact America's better idea. And as it happens, the state park was invented here in Massachusetts. You might ask, what's so different between state parks and national parks? The typical national park is a large space with an unusual landscape in a remote location that was minimally impacted by white settlement before it was preserved as a park. National parks are managed with two main goals: protecting the pre-existing biodiversity of the site and enabling passive forms of recreation like hiking and sightseeing. By contrast, state parks may be closer to population centers, on land that was once used for agriculture or industry or transportation. They may allow more active forms of recreation and typically host energetic educational programs. In other words, not only are they on land that has been more impacted by human activity in the past, they also encourage a wider range of human activity in the present. As such, they embody an alternative vision of conservation and biodiversity, one that assumes that humans and other species can thrive together. National parks, by contrast, embody a wilderness ideology that seeks to preserve nature by insulating it from humanity. That ideology is deeply problematic. As indigenous activists have pointed out, it has often been used to justify the ethnic cleansing of communities who've lived in harmony with other species for millennia. That happened in the American West in the 19th century, and it's happening across Africa today as governments create parks modeled on America's national parks. The wilderness ideology is also self-defeating. How can we motivate humans to protect nature if we think humans are the enemy of nature? When we draw a line separating the special places worth preserving from all other spaces, do we give ourselves permission to mistreat other species in every place that's not a park? What state parks can do is embody the principle that it's possible to cultivate greater biodiversity in every landscape, especially the ordinary places where we live, work, and play. Where did this idea come from? The two heroes of my story are people like myself, old white guys who devoted the final years of their lives to protecting the close-to-home wooded areas where they enjoyed hiking. Here they are, Eliza Wright and Wilson Flagg. One observer described Wright Flagg and their friend John Owen as, quote, a weird council of old Greek wood gods, not yet convinced that Pan was dead. Eliza Wright was an all-purpose reformer. He grew up in the same network of abolitionists that produced John Brown. He edited Boston papers that supported the Liberty and Free Soil parties. As he drifted away from his evangelical roots, he became a champion of religious freedom. Trained as a mathematician, Wright realized that life insurance companies were taking advantage of ordinary people. He launched the Massachusetts Life Insurance Commission to keep that industry in line. He applied the same mathematical approach to his environmentalism. Already in the 1880s, he calculated that the excess carbon dioxide produced by logging and the burning of coal was likely to change the climate in dangerous ways, even though he was not aware of the greenhouse effect. His friend Wilson Flagg, a Beverly native, was a devoted naturalist who dropped out of Harvard to walk across the country, then eked out a modest living writing nature guides and articles for horticulture magazines. As early as 1838, he was recording the blooming dates of New England wildflowers, a practice that has become much more relevant in our age of climate change. He also expressed his respect for the personhood of beings of other species through poems that, to give one example, urged humans to emulate crickets who were not, quote, deformed by an idle hope of treasure. Flagg's environmentalism was shaped by a distinctive aesthetic. The promoters of national parks typically favored sublime landscapes, places that were so large and dangerous that they reduced human beings to insignificance. Often, national park promoters also enjoyed hunting large game in such spaces. Wilson Flagg really didn't care for hunting, and he preferred picturesque landscapes that harmoniously blended the wild and the cultivated. Working independently, both Wright and Flagg developed proposals for the creation of what they called forest parks of 1 square mile or larger. Wright's proposal came first. He was the first Bostonian to imagine that the circle of rocky hills around the city might be permanently preserved for recreation, education, and the well-being of non-human species. He expressed that idea in 1847 in the abolitionist newspaper that he edited. He'd been spurred to reflection by the rural cemetery movement, which established large tree-filled cemeteries on the urban fringes, places like Mount Auburn. In 1847, the suburb of Roxbury, not yet incorporated into Boston, had announced the creation of what would become Forest Hill Cemetery, soon the final resting place of many of Boston's capitalists. As a cash-strapped activist who had already lost 5 children to disease, Wright was keenly aware that rural cemeteries catered mostly to the rich. Why not, he asked, use the proceeds from elaborate funerals to give there a resting place for the poor as well as the rich? And why not inquire if some better provision cannot be made for the comfort of the living? Wright observed that Boston Common was insufficient for the city's growing population, but that a mile-square park, 5 to 10 miles from town, would be cheaply accessible to people of all classes by the new railroads. Land there was still cheap, he wrote, and the fitting up would cost but little, for nature is what we want to get at. Wright's proposal came at a time when abolitionists and white labor activists were trying to make common cause. Wright was an ally of New York abolitionist Gerrit Smith, who had inherited a fortune from his land-speculating father. Working-class radicals criticized Smith for the hypocrisy of opposing slavery while holding a monopoly on farmland. Right? Smith decided that his critics were right, and he began distributing his land to small farmers, both black and white. He and Wright then called on the government to distribute Western land to urban workers in small parcels of about 160 acres. This would eventually lead to the Homestead Act, but the original idea was more radical. The homesteads that Wright had in mind would have restricted title, making it impossible to seize them for debt, and they could only be sold off to other landless farmers. Wright envisioned dense neighborhoods of homesteads in the Midwest, with lands further west preserved for indigenous communities. He observed that only small farmers would have time to improve the soil with intensive manuring. This was a rebuttal to the then common practice of acquiring as much land as possible, working it to depletion, and then moving further west. Wright's park proposal went hand in hand with his homestead proposal. The common idea was that of a democratically managed public domain. By the 1840s, the federal government had a long-standing tradition of stealing indigenous land and turning it over to land speculators or using it for canals and other public works designed to benefit merchants and industrialists. Wright opposed all of that and wanted the government to use its land only for the public benefit through parks and homesteads. And he wanted to pay for it with, quote, an honest direct property tax that would shift the burden of government from the backs of labor to that of capital. At the time Wright wrote that article, he had not yet met Wilson Flagg. 9 years later, Flagg prepared his own proposal to city and state governments for the creation of a forest preserve. Every city, he suggested, should purchase 1,000 acres or more of wooded land to be kept as a preserve and to be used also as a place for the study of natural history and for summer recreation. Each forest preserve would be preserved from age to age in its primitive state of wildness. Flagg's use of the word wildness might suggest that his vision was the same as that of the national park promoters, but it was really a bit different from what we think of as wildness. Certainly, the well-being of non-human species was foremost in his mind. The life of every creature, with the exception of certain offensive animals, should be held sacred within the limits of these grounds, he wrote. But this was not a plea for wildness in the usual sense. In the absence of hunters, he imagined, wild birds would become very tame and companionable, easy to study. Each forest preserve would be a place of study and recreation for man and an asylum for the inferior animals, he wrote. He also recommended the placement of marble tablets with poetic inscriptions and information about natural history. And he explicitly criticized the pursuit of wild sublimity, then fashionable among Boston's elites. It is worthy of notice, he wrote scathingly, that many persons who can give us a very good description of the White Mountains, Niagara, and other similar natural wonders know nothing at all of the beautiful and romantic scenery in their own neighborhood. There seems to be a prevailing sentiment that there is nothing admirable in nature except her monstrosities. In keeping with that sensibility, Flagg imagined that forest preserves might welcome small flocks of sheep or cows, as well as other agricultural uses. In 1856, the forest park idea was still a brainstorm. But after meeting in the 1870s, Wright and Flagg intensified their efforts. They published article after article in Boston newspapers and encouraged professional journalists to add their voices to the campaign. They took their neighbors on tours of their favorite walking paths. They held a series of forest festivals in the woods north of Boston. These events mixed citizen science with advocacy. Participants might spend the morning observing plants and animals, then listen to speeches over a picnic lunch. Wright and Flagg's advocacy ultimately led to the creation of forest parks under 4 forms of ownership: public ownership by cities and towns, public ownership by the state, private ownership by local land trusts, and private ownership by statewide land trusts. So when I talk about the state park vision, I'm really talking about all these four forms of ownership. Wright and Flagg lived only long enough to see the first, public ownership by cities and towns. In 1882, the Massachusetts legislature passed a forest law and a park law, each of which allowed municipalities to acquire land by purchase or eminent domain for the sake of conservation and recreation. A typical response to those laws was taken by attorney Samuel Sewall, friend of Wright's, and his family. Sewall had been the lawyer who represented Eliza Wright when Wright was standing trial for his involvement in the rescue of a fugitive slave. In the 1850s and 1860s, both Sewall and Wright had purchased family homes in the northern suburbs. They chose not to cut the trees on their land, allowing the process of regeneration to begin. They also instilled a love of forests in their children. Sewall's daughter Lucy, one of the first female doctors in the United States, was especially committed to protecting trees from the axe. So when she died in 1890, shortly after the death of her father, her sister Louisa gave the land to Melrose in accordance with her wishes. The park, now known as Sewall Woods, consists of 10 acres on the highest part of the family land. The gift came with a specific request that, quote, none of the trees on said premises shall be cut down unless decayed, and that the woods shall be maintained as far as possible in their present wild condition. Melrose seems to have honored the family's wishes. When I visited, the woods seemed quite mature, and the park offered a peaceful retreat for those few neighbors who know of its existence. A less typical, but perhaps more impactful use of the park law led to the creation of Lynn Woods, still one of the largest municipal parks in the United States. The preservation of 2,200 acres in the shoemaking city was the work of a mix of people with very different motives. In 1850, an amateur botanist named Cyrus Tracy created an exploring circle to learn about the flora of Essex County. A year later, a spiritualist named Hiram Marble purchased Dungeon Rock because he believed that the cave underneath contained the treasure of a 17th century pirate. Another spiritualist wrote a whole book about the story of that pirate, communicated to her by the spirits. A few decades later, the Lynn Forest Association purchased 150 acres, and that inspired Philip Chase, a wealthy civic leader, to first lobby for the passage of the park law, and then once it was enacted, to use its provisions on a far grander scale than was the case in any other city. But the success of Lynn Woods highlighted the limitations of the 1882 laws. Most of the places suitable for parks of more than 1,000 acres did not lie entirely within a single municipality, but stretched across 3 or more towns. And towns were reluctant to invest in the creation of parks whose benefits might fall to their neighboring towns. Eliza Wright spent his final days trying to come up with an ownership model that would overcome this. And in so doing, he drew together a constituency that included 3 main types of people. First, there were his old friends, professional class reformers who'd been involved in abolition. Second, there were local elites with the foresight to imagine that an impressive park might put their town or city on the map. I already mentioned Philip Chase of Lynn as one example of this. Another was Elisha Converse. Maybe some of you are wearing Converse sneakers today. Elisha Converse was both Malden's first mayor and major employer, and he ultimately donated both his personal land, his personal homestead, as one city park and much of the land that is now Middlesex Fells. The third segment of the constituency included regional and national elites, the so-called Boston Brahmins, whose families had participated in the triangular trade of the 18th century, then opened trade between the U.S. and China, established cotton mills in Waltham, Lowell, and Lawrence, and by the late 19th century, reinvested all those profits in investment banks and transcontinental railroads. In the early 1890s, these three groups of people worked together to invent both the Conservation Land Trust and the state park. In 1892, they created the Trustees of Reservations, initially an offshoot of the Appalachian Mountain Club, to preserve land across Massachusetts. Trustees leaders then helped pass an 1893 law that created a Metropolitan Park Commission to establish multi-town parks throughout Greater Boston. Finally, the first local land trust, the Andover Village Improvement Society, came along in 1894. Nowadays, we might be inclined to draw a sharp distinction between private land trusts and public parks. But in the 19th century, the line between private and public wasn't drawn in quite the same way that we might think of. Every corporation, for-profit or not-for-profit, required specific legislative approval in order to be chartered in Massachusetts. So the Trustees of Reservations were created by one act of the state legislature, and then the Metropolitan Park Commission was created by another act of the state legislature. The only difference was that the trustees solicited donations of private land and money, while the commissioners used state funds and the state's power of eminent domain. The two entities had similar leadership structures. The trustees had a self-perpetuating board of directors. The commission had a group of commissioners who were appointed, not elected, to insulate them from political pressures. In fact, both groups embodied an ethos that wasn't fully democratic. Many park creators were part of the so-called mugwump movement, which sought to shift political power from elected leaders to appointed experts at a time when the Massachusetts population was filling up with immigrants. The trustees and the Park Commission worked at a division of labor. Where direct state ownership of conservation land was possible, it was the preferred method. Where it was impossible or inconvenient, the trustees filled in the gap. Thus, the first parcel of land obtained by the trustees, Virginia Wood in Stoneham, was transferred to the Parks Commission when it created the significantly larger Middlesex Fells. Since the Metropolitan Park Commission initially authorized the creation of state parks only in the metropolitan area, the trustees shifted much of their emphasis to landscapes further from Boston, including Cape Ann. One place to begin telling the Cape Ann conservation story is with the trustees' first project, a survey of public lands in the so-called shore towns of Massachusetts from Salisbury to Fall River in the fall of 1891. Before they could begin acquiring land, the trustees wanted to know what lands had already been protected, either under the provision of the town forest law or through local organizations. And to this end, they hired journalist, activist, and Unitarian minister Jonathan Baxter Harrison to conduct a survey. Harrison is a great example of the ethos of the conservationists who immediately followed Wright and Flagg. I call this generation the problem solvers, because their usual way of working was to identify social problems that could be addressed by well-educated experts. Some of you may be familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois's anecdote about the many conversations he had with white liberals, all of which led him to think that they were really asking him, how does it feel to be a problem? At the turn of the 20th century, well-educated and public-spirited Americans were preoccupied with a number of problems. The Negro problem, the Indian problem, the labor problem. Conservation was one more problem on this list. They chose Harrison because he had a reputation as a problem-solving journalist. Raised in Ohio, Harrison had published a pro-union paper during the Civil War, then become a Unitarian minister. During a ministry in New Hampshire, he published a series of essays on why working men were attracted to the Greenback Party, a populist movement that advocated for the continued use of the paper currency introduced during the war. Harrison neither supported nor opposed the Greenbackers, He positioned himself as a neutral, sympathetic expert who could make the concerns of workers more comprehensible to elite magazine readers. He brought the same spirit of benevolent neutrality to the books and reports he composed as an agent of the Indian Rights Association. That association sought to defend indigenous communities against white racism, but also hoped to bring about, quote, the complete civilization of the Indians through their assimilation to white culture. Ironically, he urged tribes to privatize their commonly held reservations, just the opposite of the advice he would soon be giving to the towns of Massachusetts. Harrison also had long-standing environmental interests. He'd been a particularly energetic letter writer in the campaign to preserve Niagara Falls. Harrison's report for the trustees followed the template of his previous publications. He took a walking tour of the shore towns. Most, he reported, had been shockingly negligent in protecting public access to the shore. Even though, quote, the first settlers had a pretty clear idea of the value and need of open spaces for public use, their successors permitted serious encroachments upon the smaller public holdings, which were intended by the founders to be permanent. Out of 46 shore towns mentioned in the report, Harrison judged that only 8 can be regarded as fairly well equipped with parks and commons. He reserved his most fervent praise for Lynn Woods. Now you should be imagining in your own heads which towns in Cape Ann did better or worse in this report. Here's what Harrison had to say. In Essex, he observed that the shores of the Essex River were all private property, except the town farm and 2 or 3 landings. But he did praise the town for guarding its streams from defilement. In Rockport, he was alarmed to discover, quote, no public holding of any place available of any kind available as a place of public resort, no park or common or ride on the shore, except perhaps a landing or 2. Rockport had beautiful headlands, very convenient for picnics and out-of-door assemblies, he wrote, so he urged the town to move quickly to obtain them before they would be, quote, taken up for dwellings by people of means. Harrison praised the town clerk, Calvin Poole, for determining that Mount Washington could be seen from the top of Poole's Hill, but he also urged that Poole's Hill become a public hill. When Harrison got here to Gloucester, he was alarmed that the city's 25,000 people had no park or common or public holding of any kind that can be used as a place of public resort. He asked some citizens how they managed public band concerts and was told, the band takes the sidewalk, the people stand in the street. He then got into some conversations about the upcoming 250th anniversary of Gloucester's incorporation. Apparently, the plan was to memorialize the occasion by creating a factory to employ the unemployed. Harrison suggested, this is where things get a little ambiguous. Harrison suggested that if they created a park instead, they would likely receive support from the trustees of reservations, from the state, and perhaps from, quote, anybody born in Gloucester who has gone away somewhere and gotten rich. He also recommended a location, the farm adjoining the city that included the site of the old stage fort. Harrison also spent time on Gloucester's eastern point, where he was annoyed that the Eastern Point Associates had created what we would now call a gated community. At the entrance to their extensive domain of shorelands, they had built a lodge and gate and posted a sign warning visitors not to proceed without permission. Harrison says that he proceeded without permission and was not recalled, but he wondered if a picnic party of country folk might have been less warmly welcomed. He lamented that, quote, the public has no right whatever even to walk by the sea here, and contrasted the situation to his experience during a summer vacation 25 years earlier. Back then, where I passed weeks in solitude on the shores, where there are now lawn streets of costly houses. Harrison also called attention to Rafe's Chasm. He found there a monument to someone who had fallen off the ledge and urged the placement of railings to avoid similar catastrophes in the future. He praised the public-spirited woman, herself a supporter of the trustees of reservations, who owned a nearby pine grove and allowed people to use it as a picnic site, but also urged the city to move quickly to obtain the chasm itself before it would be put to use as the site of a fine house. Among the towns of Cape Ann, Manchester was the only one Harrison regarded as, quote, fairly equipped with parks and commons. That put it in the top 8 of the 46 towns he visited. He noted that Manchester owned several open spaces of various kinds that made it accessible to the public. He praised the town for providing a janitor and a building to store tables at the picnic ground at Tuck's Point. He also praised the efforts of a few thoughtful women who had saved the forests along the highway between Manchester and Essex from destruction. But, perhaps in anticipation of later events, he warned that Manchester residents were actually thinking of selling off public land, as they think the town has more land than it needs or can afford to keep. So, when all of you invited me to share my research, I thought a good strategy would be to retrace Jonathan Baxter Harrison's steps, at least for the Cape Ann part of his journey. Since I don't own a car, retracing a journey by foot comes naturally to me. Using the commuter rail to get here, I divided the journey into 4 day-long chunks and followed the seashore from Halibut Point in Rockport to the train station in Manchester, using whatever road or walking path kept me closest to the ocean. I did not achieve my goal perfectly. For example, I was too tired to check Harrison's observations about the gated community on Eastern Point. But like Harrison, my main concern was to identify publicly owned land and land that was publicly accessible. For some parts of my journey, I found the shore to be almost entirely privatized. For most of the distance between Manchester and Gloucester, I walked along a wooded highway, not quite sure whether I was 100 yards or an entire mile from the ocean. These passages put me in mind of Harrison's observation that, quote, I found leagues and leagues together of the shoreline to be all private holdings, without the intervention in these long reaches of a road or space on the shore to which the public has a right to go. In other places, though, I found evidence that Harrison's scolding had had some effect. Specifically, I often discovered what I came to think of as the common sense default. You can observe this, for example, in the Magnolia and Bass Rocks neighborhoods of Gloucester. In these places, there's a road that is closer to the ocean than any house. Now, the houses and hotels in these neighborhoods are pretty fancy. They have fabulous views, and I suspect they contribute plenty of property tax to the town's conservation and other activities. But the general public can still enjoy the same views, and through that enjoyment might feel motivated to make the shoreline hospitable to other species as well. Similarly, in the northeast corner of Rockport, public walking paths lie closer to shore than any private home. These paths lead to rocky outcroppings and beaches. Benches and other amenities make clear that many people deeply love these spaces and invest in their preservation. That's something I've encountered again and again in my journeys around metropolitan Boston, and I see it as an important echo of Wilson Flagg's idea of the picturesque. People find it easiest to care about biodiversity if they experience themselves as at home in the spaces they're preserving. That's easiest to do if they bring a little bit of home with them. It's also easiest if people are able to bring their ancestors along, which is why so many of the benches, I find, are memorials to previous park lovers. Much as I enjoyed spaces organized according to the common sense default, I couldn't help but think that these spaces were intended primarily for their nearest neighbors, all of whom could afford relatively prime real estate. These people benefit from the investments of the towns, other government bodies, and nonprofit organizations that work hard to preserve the shore. These organizations often reminded me of their existence. After experiencing the common sense default, I felt a bit of frustration that the entire Cape Ann coast is not managed in that way. Perhaps that's a bit narcissistic on my part. As far as I can tell, I am the only person inclined to use the entire Cape Ann coastline as a long-distance hiking trail. Most other walkers travel shorter distances, and my guess, you can correct me about this, is that most Cape Ann residents can walk to a publicly accessible shoreline within half an hour or so. What's more, it's not obvious that the common sense default always has the highest ecological value. The most prevalent species I observed in these places were rose hips, poison ivy, and Japanese knotweed. I assume the first was deliberately planted because it thrives on the coast. The second is native but fond of disrupted landscapes. And the third is a so-called invasive species that can make the soil less suitable for local species. For all I know, private owners may be more restorative stewards of their land. I refer to this pattern of ownership as the common sense default, but my guess is that it does not actually feel like common sense to the people who inhabit these neighborhoods. I say this because the boundary between public and private is policed and dramatized by a host of signs that remind the public of just where our rights end. Some of these signs are humorous. I don't know if you can see it. It says, "No stupid people," beyond this point. There's both poison ivy and a risk of falling beyond the point. More are combative. Many admonish, quite a few defend property rights that are rarely used, like these seats for non-existent hotel guests. Many admonish ocean-loving walkers to respect the privacy of people who are wealthy enough to own shorefront property like this house. So this says, please respect our privacy. The messages are one-sided. Private landowners are rarely reminded of where their property ends, and the public is only occasionally reassured that we have a right to be where we are. The implicit message is that private ownership is the default, the natural state of things. There's a reason for this, one that was front of mind for Harrison as well as for contemporary activists who pushed for more public access to the coast. From its founding, Massachusetts Bay Colony took a different approach to oceanfront property than other jurisdictions. In Massachusetts, private property usually extends to the low tide mark. In most other places, it stops at the high tide mark, which makes it possible at many times of day for the public to walk freely across the beach. If you have ever walked along the beach for miles, passing freely in front of private homes in Massachusetts, this has either been the result of deliberate and complicated campaigns to regain public land, or the result of trespassing on your part, for which I commend you. Harrison also felt that in the 2 centuries prior to his tour, the public rarely mobilized to defend their rights against private encroachments. Ordinary citizens simply couldn't match, quote, the astounding amount of energy and ingenuity that has been employed in the effort to appropriate the public property to private use and possession. In other words, conservation can't happen without movement building. But tragically, the success of Harrison's 19th century movement ushered in a period in which the public became passive again, leaving the work of conservation to professional park managers. One big difference between Harrison's time and our own is that far more of the beach is publicly owned today. One of the most accessible portions of my journey was the stretch including Long Beach and Rockport and Good Harbor Beach in Gloucester. Even here, I was continually reminded of the public-private boundary, especially when it came to parking. I was very glad that I personally did not need to find a place to park. The parking issue highlights an important shift over the past 100 years. Harrison was mostly concerned with making the beaches public, and he and his comrades were largely successful. Perhaps as a result, beach-going became a popular form of outdoor recreation, even for people who did not live in oceanfront towns. So the question now, as was highlighted in a 2022 report by WGBH, is whether all residents of Massachusetts should be able to go to the beach, or only those who live in towns with beaches. Now, I personally am torn about this. I live in a town without a beach, and whenever my Cape Ann journeys took me along a beach, I took advantage of the chance to go for a pleasant swim. But I would not like to live in a world in which the ordinary form of outdoor recreation involves automobile transportation. Wright and Flagg imagined that the forest parks they created would be accessible to the entire urban population of Boston by means of affordable railroads, but many of those railroads have since been abandoned. In my journeys, I observed transit beachgoers by the dozens and automotive beachgoers by the hundreds. I'd love to see more integration between conservation and transit strategies today. The prominence of beaches, both in Harrison's journey and in mine, highlights an important way in which he narrowed Wright and Flagg's original vision. For them, the whole point was to create spaces that would be hospitable to human beings of all classes and to plants and animals of all species. Harrison, by contrast, was more interested in recreation than conservation. Fortunately, many of the people who have stepped forward in recent decades to renew his work have had a more balanced sensibility. Now I'd like to zero in on a few of the specific places that I encountered on my journey, at some risk because I'm sure you know more about these places than I do, but I'll share my observations and I'll be interested in hearing your reactions in the conversation at the end. One especially interesting manifestation of my common sense default is the Atlantic Path in Rockport. You can see how old the signage is here. Like the old garden path, but extending much further, this is a rocky footpath between private homes and the ocean. As I understand it, the path is not exactly publicly owned, but made publicly accessible by the generosity of the homeowners. They seem to have a mix of attitudes about this arrangement. Some have taken steps to make the path easy to follow for all users. I was grateful to those who planted berries or installed benches. Others posted signs to keep walkers off their yards, or conversely, to keep us on the yard and off the rocks closer to the ocean. Kind of a confusing situation. This made for a tricky walking experience, and I will admit that my efforts to follow the path beyond its unmarked northern terminus resulted in a nasty case of poison ivy. My experience raised a number of questions about the role of personal care in the maintenance of spaces that are hospitable to people and other species. To what extent had homeowners invested time and money making the path accessible to me? Were the homeowners who did this also tending to the well-being of other species? For example, by removing invasives or acting to prevent erosion of the shoreline? Was this sign informing me that the beautiful white rocks are private rocks, really defending the abstract idea of private property, or was it intended to prevent hundreds of people from taking the shore home with them because they happen to like those white rocks? I'm not sure. My case of poison ivy resulted from my desire to follow the shoreline all the way to Halibut State Park. Perhaps some of you more adept on slippery rocks have managed that feat. I eventually found my way to the park along the main road, and there I discovered a classic case of the interplay between the trustees of reservations, the state park system, and local officials and activists. As I'm sure many of you know, halibut Point centers on a granite quarry that was abandoned in 1929. The trustees got involved 5 years later by purchasing a strip of land between the quarry and the shore. At the time, the US military was developing the site for radar. And then the quarry became a privately owned recreational area known as Pitcairn Park. Finally, in 1981, the trustees facilitated the creation of the state park, and maybe some of you were involved in that work at the time. The result is a hodgepodge of ownership. If you follow the paths from the state park, you can cross into trustees' land and then onto town-owned shoreline, but only after being admonished not to venture onto the adjacent private land. This is nothing unusual. This is the typical scenario that I've seen again and again in various places that began to be preserved in the 19th century or later. All of the original Massachusetts state parks, Beaver Brook, Middlesex Fells, Blue Hills, and Stony Brook, have similar patchworks of ownership. Between Halibut Point and the commuter rail station, I encountered dozens of other quarries that are now conservation land. This pattern exemplifies one of the most appealing aspects of the state park vision. Some of the best places to promote biodiversity are on lands that have already been disrupted by human activity. For me, as a one-time visitor, it was hard to identify the exact process by which the land was preserved, or even exactly where I was. I've already begun this conversation with Jim. I think the pictures here include Carlson's Quarry and Flat Ledge Quarry, but I really can't tell for sure because I was usually lost. I should also note that most of the other people I encountered in this part of my journey were accompanied by dogs. And I want to say that dogs are underappreciated allies in the work of conservation. I know environmentalists who worry about the impact of dog poop on forests, but from my perspective, the far more important fact is that dogs so frequently alert their humans to the fact that there are nearby forests worth preserving. A different day's journey took me to Stage 4 Park. This is one of the first fruits of Jonathan Baxter Harrison's Guilt Tripping Report of 1891. In 1897, the state legislature passed a bill, subsequently endorsed by Gloucester citizens, directing the city's Board of Park Commissioners to use eminent domain to create Stage 4 Park as, quote, a permanent memorial of the first settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The city began implementing the plan in 1898, though not without resistance. When the city invited 46 owners of adjacent property to offer feedback at a public hearing, all but one of the speakers objected both to the creation of the park and to the city's premise that adjacent property owners should contribute to the cost because their property would rise in value as a result. Even the one neighbor who did support the park objected to paying the costs up front. He wanted to be assessed after the park was created. Reading between the lines, it appears that real estate developers, rather than individual property owners, may have been the primary source of opposition. Only 3 neighbors, including the supporter, actually showed up to the meeting in person. One lawyer spoke on behalf of individuals who are about to inherit 2 large estates. Another represented a property that was already on the market, with the expectation that it would be cut up into house lots. The substantial majority of neighbors did not express their views at all, perhaps because they were absentee owners living elsewhere. The family whose land was actually taken for the park, for example, lived in Boston. The opposition notwithstanding, the city moved forward and created the park that I'm sure many of you have enjoyed. Like so many park creators in other cities, they were motivated by civic boosterism as well as recreational needs. By authorizing the park's creation, the Commonwealth had effectively endorsed Gloucester's self-understanding as the first settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because merchants from Dorchester, England, had left 14 men here in the fall of 1623. The park today works hard to reinforce that narrative, though not with perfect success. When I was taking this photo, my work with my camera got the attention of a family who lingered to read the inscription. A boy who looked to me to be about 11 years old then declared with indignation, Massachusetts Bay Colony did not start in 1623. It started in 1630. Personally, I'm amused that although the park was inspired in part by Gloucester's 250th anniversary, it offers a narrative that suggests that anniversary shouldn't have been celebrated in 1891 at all, but much further back in 1873. Thomas himself was involved in the East Indian trade, textile manufacturing, railroads, and Central American fruit plantations. The Coolidges were connected to other Roman families involved in conservation. Mehetabel's niece, Harriet Hemingway, for example, co-founded the Massachusetts Audubon Society and donated much of the land that is now the Blue Hills Reservation. Environmentalist commitments notwithstanding, the Coolidges left a record of astonishing wastefulness on their stunning peninsula north of Manchester. Thomas Jefferson Coolidge built what he called a cottage, we would probably call a mansion, in 1873. His son replaced the cottage with the so-called Marble Palace in 1904. In the 1950s, the grandson tore that down and built yet another mansion, which had been torn down by 1989. By that time, Coolidge descendants began donating their land to Essex County Greenbelt. When they donated the mansion site to the trustees in 1990, Greenbelt transferred ownership of its parcel. Even so, the reservation occupies only part of the peninsula that is also the site of other mansions, which means that visitors must traverse a path through private land where we are once again reminded of the superior claims of privacy. The management of the Coolidge Reservation raises questions about the ultimate goals of organizations such as the Trustees of Reservations that seek to maintain outdoor spaces for both conservation and recreation. Ideally, these spaces would invite their human visitors into ways of being that allow humans and other species to thrive together. But at Coolidge, that goal is blended with efforts to preserve the memory of the donors. Even though the mansion is gone, we are encouraged to contemplate what it might be like to have a gigantic mown lawn with a panoramic view of the ocean. On the other hand, the trustees don't mow the entire lawn. There are also portions that are managed to encourage the return of wildflowers. Perhaps that awkward balancing act actually epitomizes the vision of state parks that I've been promoting here, but it still made me uneasy in this particular case. I felt that unease again when I followed the path from the reservation to a beach that was carefully cordoned off between public and private uses, as well as the uses that were just for those people like myself who are in fact members of the Trustees of Reservations. The last place I'd like to talk about embodies a different balancing act, in part because it has a different history. During the years that the Coolidges were building and tearing down mansions, the descendants of some of Gloucester's oldest families were gradually abandoning the area known as Dogtown Common. It was virtually unoccupied for a century before it became conservation land in 1985. At that time, the city was motivated by a desire to crack down illegal activity as much as a desire for conservation. At least that's what the signs say. During my visit, I was intrigued by Dogtown's variety of interesting geological features. So I was trying to track which feature corresponded to which name on my map. And also by the mix of historic reconstruction, focused on abandoned house lots, such as the one shown here, and quirky public art. Of all the places I visited in Cape Ann, it was also the one that afforded me the most opportunities for the great pleasure of getting lost. In just 40 years of public ownership, the residents of Gloucester have found many ways to build caring relationships with Dogtown. One person freely loans these handcrafted walking sticks to visitors. I was also impressed by the city's choice to place its composting facility right at the entrance to a hiking area. This is a helpful reminder that conservation can coexist with multiple human uses simultaneously. Just as any ecosystem serves multiple purposes for the diverse species that inhabit it. Diversification of human uses is something that I've seen in many parks, closer to Boston, that have devoted some of their park space to community gardens. As I wandered through Dogtown, I found myself wondering about the ecological consequences of its 100 years of abandonment as compared to deliberate conservation. To what extent do wild spaces, especially small wild spaces surrounded by dense population, need active human attention to become more biodiverse? Dogtown could provide a good test case of this because it is adjacent to land that has been more intentionally conserved for a longer period by the Cape Ann Sportsman Club. It would also be interesting to compare its biodiversity to places of similar size that have been publicly owned for more than a century, such as Lynn Woods. Well, that's it for my reconstruction of Jonathan Baxter Harrison's tour of Cape Ann. I'm sure many of you can tell me about beautiful places that I missed. Before we begin that conversation, I'd like to commend two organizations that repeatedly reminded me of their existence as I walked. Essex County Greenbelt is one of the many local land trusts that do the same thing as the trustees of reservations on a more intimate scale. It was started in 1961 and holds 21,500 acres, much of it in small parcels that were once family farms. These places help ensure that most residents of Cape Ann can find a wild space very close to home, such as Send Field in Gloucester, with its nice memorial bench, or Woodland Acres in Rockport. These places also create wildlife corridors that allow animals and plants to migrate among the larger spaces. That's important as climate change forces all species to move to more hospitable ground. Cape Ann Trail Stewards is a volunteer-driven organization with just one staff person and no office. I don't know when it was created or whether it owns any land directly, but its signature blazes were my constant companions wherever I wandered. Both of these organizations do something that was very important to Eliza Wright and Wilson Flagg. They help ordinary citizens form deep and sustained relationships of love and care with specific, close-to-home places. That is a piece of the original state park vision that was lost for most of the 20th century, as professional park managers and wealthy donors cared for parks without much input from the broader public. But everywhere I turn today, I encounter a reminder that someone has loved a particular place, or some ancestor still inhabits that place. I hope all of you have such a place whose inhabitants of all species will remember you when you're gone.